I think one of the recommendation I would have for most developers is to try to work in a way that maximizes your individual learning rather than your task completion.
ProCognita, Get Agile podcast.
Maximize learning to maximize value creation. Interview with Bas Vodde.
Hi, and welcome to Get Agile podcast. Today with me is Bas Vodde, co-creator of LESS framework, I believe we can call it.
Yeah.
And we are right now in the very city center of Warsaw during the LESS conference. So we wanted to get a little bit into the team working together in LESS. So the idea of having many teams working together on one product, and why, from your perspective, is that important?
Why is it that many teams work on one product?
Yeah, because my perspective is many organizations say that's super difficult and we cannot do this one, and in our context we can do that. So
and what would be the alternative then when you have a larger product and you think
the alternative is usually you define a lot of small products.
Okay. So why do we prefer not to have smaller products and have larger products with many teams closely collaborating on that larger product?
Yes, that's a pretty good question.
Well, one of the things we do in LESS is we try to avoid defining our product from the technology perspective, which is what happens a lot in large organizations. It tends to also optimize your agility, adaptiveness, flexibility towards just the technology. And in the end, you'll need to focus on value to customers and also for your customers being able to change that direction whenever their particular situation changes. And therefore, there's more guidelines, but one of the initial guidelines is try to think of what does your customer actually think your product is. And then your product will not be a microservice or an app very often. Like today in the LESS conference, Cesario Ramos gave a wonderful talk, and he mentioned, like, is the car renting app, would that be a product? The clear answer from a LESS perspective is of course no, because nobody buys a car renting app. But many people in the table were surprised by that, because they'd always thought of the app often as a product, and from a LESS perspective it isn't, because the app is not that customer-centric thing that they actually, not what your end customer actually would want to have. So the product tends to be larger, and then you have multiple teams working on that. And then one of the, and I guess that's where part of where your question comes from, then one of the things that we would like to have in LESS is for those teams to collaborate as much as possible and not split this larger product into small parts that the individual teams could focus on.
Yeah, in fact, what you just started saying is like the way I'm trying to explain this one is you have a Agile 0.1, which is basically you do the component team, the technology team. This is what you mentioned, and this is like you have an optimization about the technology, not about the business. Then you can build a 2.0 for me is like we're doing a lot of business teams, but we get a lot of small business area. So we focus, like we have a selling team, we have a marketing team, we have a whatever else team. And then you end up with the another option is you have many teams, have a bigger product definition, larger product definition, and this has a lot of consequences into the how you work together, right? And really want to dig into that, because I believe this is one of the challenges companies have.
What is the
having many teams working on one product? So you get a bigger definition of the product.
Yeah.
You ask many teams to work on one code base,
Yeah.
one area, one goal together, and it's super difficult, right? And you want to deep dive into why it is super difficult, first of all, and then how those people can act. So what is the problem behind that, and how we can help them, or how they can help themselves.
Okay. It's a lot of questions. So let me try to put that a little bit in how I see it contextually, and also in our community at the moment. It's like if we think about just agile development, the history of that, in the beginning it clearly started always with one team. Right? In fact, in 2001, when the Agile Manifesto got created, people clearly said at that point, this works well if you have one team, but not when you have many teams working on a larger product. Right? And as I pointed out in the previous answer, we'd like to have larger products because we'd like to look at the product from a customer view.
Which is kind of, against the idea of having a small product,
well,
right?
Not so much, but then what happened in the Agile community and over time is that people try to solve the problem of more teams on a larger product by being convinced that the key to that is to have independent teams that can work on their part. Because then we can take the lessons learned from early Agile development and basically copy-paste it through our organization.
And each team has their own area, so 2.0, right?
So you'll end up with small products, and each team focuses on their product, being slightly removed from the customer, because that's the side effect of that, of course. And unless we don't want to do that, we want to have multiple teams work together on the same product. And one of the realizations for me, and it took me a while to make that more explicit, is that we just don't want to do independent teams in the way that it is suggested. I mean, that desire for creating independence is preventing thinking about how to work with multiple teams together. Multiple teams is not just multiple single teams. But then the follow-up of that, of course, is, okay, but why did we wanted to have that team independence? And at least my conclusion is not so much that the team independence comes from a desire to not talk with other people or teams or to learn from them, but the desire to not be blocked by something that you consider you're responsible for. Right? There's a lot of frustration if you're building something and I need something from another team, and the other team, it's not their highest priority, so they're not doing that right now, so you're kind of blocked and waiting. And that's where I think a lot of the frustration comes from. So therefore, unless one of the things we try to do is to let the teams collaborate, but in a way that they're not blocked and waiting for each other, but they're learning from each other. And the effect of that, to get to your question, is that we can have many teams working on a larger customer feature rather than trying to give larger customer features to separate teams.
So yeah, the way I explain the Scrum team or the development team in there is like you are supposed to have an interdependency inside, but mostly you're looking for no dependency outside. And by the no dependency, what you mean is it's not that we don't want to talk to each other, it's like we are supposed to be allowed to make any decision or make any changes in the code that are necessary to deliver value. This is I believe what you're saying.
Yeah, there shouldn't be any point where with the items that you picked up, you are dependent on or blocked by the other team. But at any point, we would like the teams to be able to say to another team, hey, can you guys help us out? it would help us if we could work together on that. And then if the team says yes, which in the more, I guess, experienced, less adoptions, teams love helping each other out, then you get that mutual benefit, mutual learning, almost kind of merging the teams into sort of one large team. But if they say no, then you say, okay, then we'll do it ourselves, because we're not blocked by you helping us. We understand that you also have your own things, and we understand it's okay to not immediately drop your high priority things because we would like to work together with you, and therefore you would just continue by yourself with your own team.
So basically, lack of dependency doesn't mean that you are not allowed to ask for help. This is what you're saying.
It's even encouraged, and that's where in LESS we often use the phrase shared work, and shared work means that teams pick up very closely related features, so very closely related product backlog items. They give them to different teams, and what often I see in LESS adoptions that are that I would consider pretty good is that teams actually do that on purpose, because they would like to work together during the sprint, and they would like to learn from each other during the sprint.
But it doesn't seem to be a kind of common approach for most of the companies. So why is it so hard to switch from we have an independent team working on their own area, rather to we have few teams working together, still independent but looking for this help? Why is it so hard to get to that point?
That's an excellent question, and for many teams, I think it is, for many organizations, it's very counterintuitive. And I think partly it is because the assumption that close collaboration is going to result in this frustration and blocking, right? So in people's mind, they often associate working closely together as being in a situation where you're dependent on the other person and being blocked. And also for me, it took a long time to kind of pull that out of each other and to realize that collaboration doesn't need to be in a way of, I need this from you, otherwise I can't continue. But it can also be in the way as, hey, it would be great if we could work together in this, because we both benefit from it and we learn from it. But if not, then I don't need you, I don't require you, I can work without you also.
So it kind of sounds for me like I have my task, I'm gonna code my task and don't interrupt me, to be like a default mode in most of the organization. As long as I don't need the help, then it's easy for me to focus on my task. This how it sounds for me a little bit.
Yeah, maybe, but I do want to relate that also a little bit to how some developers, or I guess many developers, look at their own work. I worked in a team the last 2 years most of the time, and one of my team members.
We just want to add that you work coding, not just observing.
Yeah, clear. In a team means you're.
Oh well, it's maybe a different meaning for the people who are watching us. So just want to make clear that we are not making up here a theory. You're talking about your experience, not about you think something that could happen, right?
Yeah. I don't want to sidetrack too long, but I found it hilarious that at some point somebody just didn't believe that and thought it was just a fraud. I was a bit. I spend most of my time writing code in a team. Cannot I? But anyway, so I've been in it not at this moment anymore, but for 2 years. I loved my team, but one of the team members there, a great guy. One of the habits he had was to always help other people. He's just a very helpful person by nature, and especially also our customers. Like when a customer would request something, he would immediately reply, to the point where sometimes we, the rest of the team, would try to take the unassigned request immediately to some of the other team members so that he wouldn't reply, so that he wouldn't need to reply on everything. But one of the things that he had is that he had often frustration that at the end of the day it felt he didn't do any work, right? Because in his mind, just like you said, he associated the work with the tasks that he had planned to do that day. And then one of the things when we were in a conversation, I said, doesn't have to be like that. Like when I work the entire day, then of course in the beginning of the day I think maybe I should do these and these tasks. But if the entire day team members ask questions and I help them out and things like that, then at the end of the day, how much I help the other team members is of more value than how much of the individual task I completed.
So the team speed versus individual speed. So speed, and we have a team's speed instead of individual team speed in case of scale.
And even more important for me, not so much the team speed, but just the team learning. Because helping other people out and kind of working on something together sometimes might not even increase the team speed, at least not in the short run. But in the long run, the team ought to constantly learn more about the technology, the domain, different practices, etc. You only do that if you're closely collaborating.
Which is another thing that Craig Larman just mentioned today about learning as a goal of working together. Can we look into this one? Like, why you and Craig seems to be so focused on this learning? Why is it so critical from your perspective for the organization to focus on this learning? Just instead of leaving this for accidentally happen.
Instead of
leaving this to happen,
letting it accidentally happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the way I like to always explain that is just based on my experience. Product development is mostly the process of knowledge creation. And I sometimes gave the thought experiment where I would ask people to do a programming exercise, and they would in their mind do that. Then I'd ask them, what would happen if we now throw away your code or your disk rest and you didn't use version control and you're doing the same thing again? Would the second time be faster, same, or slower than the first time? And virtually everyone says, the second time will be a lot faster, right? And then I would ask, but it's the same task, right? And if the length of a task is just related to the task itself, it's an attribute of the task. When I give you twice the same task, it will take roughly the same amount of time, right? But it doesn't. And one of the key reasons for that is that the output of development is the knowledge that you created. So product development to me is very much about trying to maximize knowledge creation within the team and the organization about the technology, about the practices, and also about understanding your customer and business domain.
So it is about the maximizing the value, maximizing the knowledge, both of them, or is it just now we are getting into philosophical discussion?
Not really, because the effect of trying to maximize the knowledge creation is that people have a broader view, are easier able to change. So it leads to maximizing value creation and agility or adaptiveness.
So the organization that know how to learn on the organizational level is more adaptive. I mean, that's a prerequisite for the adaptiveness, right? This is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, calling it a prerequisite would probably exclude potential other
Okay.
that I am not aware of myself or not experienced.
Strong,
But
strong influential?
the way we look at it is yes, in order to create an adaptive organization, in order to focus on maximizing your value delivery and agility, then focusing on knowledge creation is the key. And to me, and this is also where me and Craig have both been influenced by, that's not a new thing. Like I often like to refer back to an old software development book called Debugging the Development Process, which described the Microsoft Excel version 1 project, basically a post-retrospective, post-mortem of the first version of Excel, how they built that. And one of the practices they had was that as soon as somebody became an expert in their area, then they would immediately move him away. Because as soon as somebody is an expert, he wouldn't learn anymore, and other people wouldn't work there, and they wouldn't learn anymore either. But if they moved them away, then that person would need to learn a new area, new skills, and it would leave the space for other people to learn what he would be the expert in.
Yeah.
So at that time, they were managing that development by trying to maximize the learning and knowledge creation.
Which is not, recent even, by the way. I mean, the Excel 1.0 is not a recent event.
That's why I said this is not, from our perspective, this is not a new idea. This is, if you look back at successful products, I think you often see this theme of having this broader view of your product, working closely together, maximizing the amount of learning that's going on there. So it's, for me, a theme that has always returned into product development.
All right. A side comment is that we will try to put the book into the footnotes of this recording, so you may be able to find it. And a second side comment which comes to me from Greg Hutchins, he said, "Show me your specialist, I will show you the bottlenecks of the system." So basically this is what you're saying. So removing the specialist is removing the bottlenecks, because more people need to learn this area.
Yeah, it's one aspect of it.
Yeah. So I'm gonna roll back a little bit to the conversation we had about why it is difficult, and the second. So one thing we were just saying is like people assumption that they are supposed to work on the task instead of them working together as a team and working together as teams.
Yeah.
Second is we don't know how to code together on one piece of code in 2 weeks, right? And there are some ideas about how to approach this one. I would love to hear from the developer, not just from the from the theoretical expert, but from the developer. How you make many people, many teams work together on the same single code to make sure that it doesn't blow up at the review, right?
Okay. Well, for me, this question is even more amusing, especially given the context that I gave earlier about the history of Agile development in our community, because one of the early Agile methods was extreme programming, and this was around the book was published in 1999, and before that there was the online discussions about this. But when it was released at that point, it was fairly controversial, and one of the controversial parts of it was the idea of shared code ownership. And because before that, usually people looked at my file and my class in the code, and extreme programming said, no, we don't want to divide the code base into different peoples who own particular classes or files, and instead we want to have this shared code ownership. Oh, and by the way to make that work is to write more automated tests, to continuously integrate the work of the different team members, to have an automated build, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So extreme programming brought up and the idea of abandoning individual code ownership and the, if you wish, the common practices that enabled that. But then, and that part I never understood, then when there's multiple teams, for some reason people have concluded that that practice is limited to the boundary of a team. And especially if you consider that the boundary of a team is kind of an arbitrary decision in most organizations, you're suddenly deciding that the practice of shared code ownership is limited to a completely arbitrary decision within your organization.
And if I think about this one, if you move from the 1990s to now, so 25, 30 years in time, then you figure out, you said in the 1990s that was controversial, and some of those ideas, most of those ideas seems to be still controversial, like, spending time doing the testing or like automating testing, not just the testing, right? Or doing the continuous integration as the continuous integration, not having a servers that run every week or something like that, right?
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, they're not controversial anymore. They're generally accepted and not
ignored.
Yeah.
It's like washing their hands. Like we need pandemic to change the behaviors.
Yeah, I mean, I work with lots of teams. Yeah, unit testing is great. How many unit tests do you have? None. But why don't you do it then? And most of the teams also don't know where to get started. It's not that they have no interest of doing that, but it has to do with skills, because I guess most universities don't teach in-depth writing test or test-driven development or things like that.
A friend of mine has an idea that there was exponential growth of the Scrumish approach and linear growth of the XP approach, and then you have a gap between those two.
Yeah.
So sounds like.
And I think so too. And but the interesting aspect now is that they're not controversial, but just not used, which is a different thing than in the 1990s. But it is still controversial to break the shared code ownership boundary across multiple teams. And in a way, I'm sad that is still controversial in many places, because we've been explaining the dynamics of component teams owning components and then limiting the ownership to that particular team. The larger dynamics in organizations now also already for 15 years, but still it seems to be controversial.
So seems like this independent. If we have an independent team with their own code ownership, we end up with many small Agile components or the small products, because we cannot work on the same code. This basically. So we start with the code ownership. We end up with the small
blocking
teams.
Dependencies between the teams
and tracking dependencies.
Lack of customer focus, not being able to work with your customers closely because their requirements don't fit necessarily to what your responsibility are from the systems, and more and more and more.
And you have more people to manage this one, and you have more system to manage this one, and you end up with a lot of people doing a lot of things in the organization. Okay, so we focus mostly on the I would say we focus on the developer role into the system. So how the developer behaviors impact how the organization deliver value. Basically, this is what we're saying. So if I were to ask you about the recommendation for the developers, how to start if they want to go into that direction. So understanding the common code ownership, understanding the CI, CD ideas, TDD, and all this stuff. What would you recommend them? What would you suggest them to start with?
I think one of the recommendations I would have for most developers is to try to work in a way that maximizes your individual learning rather than your task completion. And that by itself, I think, will already have a big impact. It will definitely slow you down. Like one of the things I've noticed is that often when working with teams, they pick up a certain task, they complete the task, and it works, but they're not fully understanding why or how it works. Like the things behind it, or maybe a part that they got somewhere else, etc.
Sound like a copy-paste solutions.
Yeah, and or just what I sometimes refer to as random programming. Just randomly try something until it happens.
It works. Okay.
But not only that, also like the documentation said in this JavaScript framework, we need to put it in this kind of handler. So we put it there, but not understanding why your code would be called at that particular place. Just doing it because the documentation said I need to do it, rather than understanding why you need to put it there. So if you change the development attitude from every time when you put something and you do it because it was on Stack Overflow, or you randomly tried, or you just followed the documentation, to just pause a little bit and ask the question, okay, why did that work for me? What can I learn from this further? And that will definitely slow you down in the beginning, but that individual practice just starts maximizing your learning, and very quickly, like weeks, you'll discover that you're actually going faster because you have a better view of understanding what's going on. So, and then with that practice also just regularly read something, watch some the YouTube videos. There's lots of good books on unit tests and test-driven development, and then spend a little bit of time trying these things out, right? And the biggest advice is to not try to optimize your individual work by trying to finish your tasks as fast as possible, because once you optimize your work that way, ironically, you will finish your tasks much slower than if you optimize it towards more of a learning.
Which is also a message to all the managers helping the teams, the development teams. It is not about how fast your people code, it is not about how fast they move the task to done.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not saying like take 2 months off to figure something out, because as a developer, you're expected to also complete some functionality, but just take that breathing space and a bit of extra time every day to just stop and figure out why it's working, learn something, try out something, and if you just do that little bit extra every day extra, then that will dramatically improve your development practice.
All right.
And then share that, of course, with your team. Try to maximize the sharing of your teams.
And you can do this through pair programming, mob programming, which is yet another great idea.
Yeah, but even in the daily, say, hey, yesterday I did this and it worked great. So if you want to know more about it, I can have a short talk about it.
So not just how much I earn, but how much I learn, I guess.
Absolutely.
All right, so we're going to close with this positive message to you, all the developers, and also to all managers working with the developers and the product. And thanks for watching us. And if you like the video, please subscribe. Thank you. And thank you.
Thank you.
To learn more, visit procognita.com/getagile.